Focus on just talking. So like, I think we're good. Let me make sure. Yes, I could.
Testing 1, 2.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Let's see if this.
Somebody's coffee's up here.
Oh, yeah, me too. The
Oh,
way.
no, not blue. It's just, I bet you want that before it gets too cold.
Yeah, forget.
Yeah, somebody might just have that presenter mode or something.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, I think you're good. If you're at the podium, I'm gonna just double check and make sure that the sound is coming through. Good here. Testing 1, 2. Check that out, but it sounded like it was doing okay.
So are we good to start? Thank you. Right, well, thank you all again for having us this morning. I'm Cody Straley. I'm the National Register and Architectural Survey Coordinator for the West Virginia State Historic Preservation Office, which is a really big mouthful, so please don't ask me to repeat that. So I guess I'll briefly start with explaining the National Register program, what it is, what it means, criteria for eligibility, and things of that nature. National Register program dates back to the 1966 National Historic Preservation Act, which mandated that each state implement historic preservation programs to better document and preserve their historic properties. And so that created the National Register program, as well as other various historic preservation incentives. So what is SHPO? What is our office? We are tasked with documenting the state's historical sites and encouraging their preservation. And we do this through a variety of methods, such as offering tax credits and matching grants for projects. We assist the public in writing National Register nominations and helping get those approved through the National Park Service. We work to ensure that projects have as minimal a negative impact as possible on historical sites. So like government projects to redo roads or grant-funded demolition projects, things like that. We try and encourage people to make sure those works don't damage historic properties. And contrary to popular belief, we do not have the power to block or delay such projects that have a negative impact on historical sites. We encourage people not to do these things, but legally we can't stop them completely. So what is the National Register? It is the official nationwide list of historical sites and districts that have been deemed worthy of preservation by the federal government. It's overseen by the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior, and administered locally by historic preservation offices such as ours. Today, there's about 100,000 nominations around the country, encompassing 2 million individual resources. Any building, site, structure, object, things like that. And we have about 1,100 such sites in West Virginia and counting. So what does listing do? What happens if your property is on the National Register? It's primarily an honorary designation. It provides national recognition and prestige for your property. It offers some limited protection from state or federally funded actions. Properties are eligible to apply for grants, both through our office and various other organizations. And they're eligible to apply for historic rehabilitation tax credits, which Meredith will discuss more later on. What listing does not do? Many people think that listing imposes very strict restrictions on your property. That's not the case, at least from a state or federal level. Local governments can impose their own restrictions, but that's not a requirement. Listing does not restrict the use or sale of historic property. It doesn't require the continued maintenance of a property. It doesn't require you to open the property up to the public for tours or whatnot. It doesn't guarantee funds for restoration projects or perpetual maintenance. You're eligible to apply for funding, but there's no guarantee you get funding. It does not protect a property from demolition. We have no legal recourse for punishing you if you tear down a building. And you don't get a free historical marker for the property. You're welcome to buy one on your own, but we don't distribute markers. Qualifications. The Park Service has a series of criteria for determining eligibility of a property on the register. In most cases, the property has to be at least 50 years old, with some minor exceptions. The property must retain historic integrity, and this is key. The Park Service defines integrity as the ability of a resource to convey its historic appearance. So in other words, does the property still look historic? Does it still look like the way it did decades ago when it was in its historic heyday? If you make alterations to a building, such as replacing wooden siding with vinyl siding, replacing windows with non-historic ones that look different, putting an entirely new material on the exterior, adding an addition, tearing down a portion of it, changing the way the roof looks, all of that diminishes historic integrity. And if too much integrity is lost on a property, it might become ineligible to be listed, regardless of how historically important it was. You have to have owner consent, of course. And then the property has to meet at least one of a set of different criteria for eligibility. You can't just list a property because it's old. You have to have a historic theme the property is connected to. Like, it's important to the history of what makes it important historically. I break those down one by one. We have criterion A, which is for properties that were the site of a historic event, a trend or pattern. This is a pretty broad category. It's for properties that can be connected to the history of like transportation, agriculture, business, education, ethnic history, industry, politics, things of that nature. One example here is a company store in Thomas in Tucker County. It was listed for its connection to the history of the coal industry because it was a historic coal company store. Criterion B, which is used on fewer occasions, is for properties connected to a historically important person during the productive part of their life or career. Usually it's the home or workplace of an individual. Like we have the Memphis, Tennessee Garrison House in Huntington. It was the home of a prominent civil rights activist and NAACP officer. We have criterion C. These are for properties that are a well intact, very good example of a historic architectural style, an engineering technique, landscape design, or the work of a master craftsman. This can include many houses and public buildings, public artwork, sculptures, monuments that are old enough, bridges, tunnels, and dams if they have a particularly interesting engineering style, and even parks, cemeteries, and other designed landscapes can qualify as well. This is the Insane Asylum in Weston. It was listed for being a very impressive example of Gothic architecture and for being the largest or second largest hand-cut stone building in North America. Second in the world. So pretty cool. And criterion D, you can't read that too well. It's primarily for archaeological sites. It's for properties that have the potential to yield new information on a historic theme. So largely archaeological properties. If you can dig a site and find bones, artifacts that can tell you more about the history of that people or that area, that would qualify. Primarily in this state, it's for like Native American burial mounds, the sites of colonial or Civil War era forts, some coal campsites, and on small occasions, some cemeteries. Now, what is a historic district? So a district is when you take a large group, a large gathering of different buildings and properties and unite them together under a single historical theme. Specifically, the Park Service defines it as something that possesses a significant concentration, linkage, or continuity of sites, buildings, structures, or objects connected historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development. So neighborhoods, for example. The resources in a district must collectively meet at least one of the criteria of eligibility, which was discussed previously. For downtown commercial districts, like the street here in Oak Hill, most districts like that typically qualify under criterion A for commercial history, or sometimes criterion C for architecture. If you have a lot of impressive architectural styles represented there in your district. A district must be contiguous. This is important. It can't be divided into separate freestanding parcels. It has to be one singular boundary connecting everything together and just chop it up. So things you'll need, you have to click a lot for this one. For a district, you will need consent from at least 50% of the property owners. So say in the district, you have 100 people who own properties in the district. If more than 50, if 50 or more people, 50 or more owners object to the listing, it doesn't pass. If 49 people object to the listing, it can pass. So you will need some PR campaigning to get a district to qualify. Next. You need some location information. You'll need to clearly define the boundaries for the district with maps, pictures, coordinates, things like that. You'll need a physical description of every building and other resource in the district, whether or not they are historic. For our nominations, we typically have people put like a 1 to 3 sentence spiel explaining each building, like what it looks like, what are the main building materials, does it have historic importance or does it not? You need a written history of the district, including its development, major events that have occurred here, changes that have occurred to the district over time, things like that. And reference materials. You'll need a very good bibliography of resources you consultant to write this nomination, like any articles or books, property records, interviews that help provide information on the district's history that you use for your nomination. We'll need that in the list. And then good current photos of the district to give us and the Park Service an idea of what it looks like today and what its integrity is. This is an example of a map for a historic district in Spencer that's upcoming next season. So the green line depicts the boundaries of the proposed district, and it includes everything within those boundaries. The buildings that are shaded in gray are the historic buildings, which we call contributing resources to a district. And then the ones inside that are white are non-historic, which we call non-contributing buildings. All buildings within a district have to be noted in a nomination, but only the ones that are contributing are entitled to all the benefits of being listed. So for a nomination, you would include a list of all resources, both historic and non-historic, as I mentioned already. Briefly describe each one. If you click, I have a red box, yeah. So this here briefly describes a property in Wheeling, 1.5-story craftsman bungalow, blah, blah, blah. It has this, this, and that. Again, it notes that the building is contributing because it has historic integrity and historic importance. Next. The building below it is non-contributing because it's just a single-story commercial garage that has had some alterations, and in this case wasn't old enough to qualify. Next. The written narrative in the nomination is called the Statement of Significance. This is where you write the argument for why the property should be listed. You'll explain the history of the district and argue why it meets the criteria for eligibility. If you want to click. And this is a very brief encapsulation of such an argument. This district meets criterion A because it has connections to commercial history, community planning, because it was a major streetcar and an automobile neighborhood, blah, blah, blah. Next. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. And as such, the district represents important local commerce from this year to this year. And timeline for listing. How long it takes to list a property varies. Depends on, are you going to hire a consultant? How long do they take to do the paperwork? Does the paperwork need to be revised or edited? Go through multiple draft revisions and various other factors. But as step one, typically for a district, people will bring in a historic preservation consultant, a professional who will come in, do the research, survey the property, and determine is the district eligible and how big it should be and what should be included in the district. Step two, the consultant will present their findings to you and to our office. We will review their findings and determine whether or not we recommend that you pursue a nomination. And if we say, maybe you shouldn't do that, you can still do that. You can say, well, I don't care what you think, we're going to try anyways. You're welcome to do that. We will process a nomination regardless. The nominator will work on completing the nomination form. You can use the same consultants to do the nomination form. You can hire a different one. You can try and do it yourself, whatever makes more sense to you all. We review the draft nomination form. We put comments. We recommend edits to it until we get to a final draft that we think would qualify with the Park Service. Next. If we think a nomination is ready to go, it's finalized, we schedule it to be presented at a meeting of the State Archives and History Commission for approval. They are a bipartisan body of professionals in the history field who meet 3 times a year to review and vote on these nominations. Then, assuming they say yes, and they usually do, we forward the nomination to National Park Service for their final review. And they will have the option to either approve, reject, or recommend further revisions to the nomination. And assuming they approve, we notify property owners and local officials. You get the prestige of listing, and we all live happily ever after. This is my contact information. I'm happy to take any questions. If not, Meredith can talk to you about the tax credit aspect of historic districts.
So if we're about Oak Hill, which we are, so every building in the district that we are proposing would have to have that description and all that information that you.
Yeah, you would have to note every single building within the boundary you want to draw, whether or not it is historic. And for a district, in order for a district to collectively have enough integrity, you really have to watch the ratio of historic to non-historic buildings in the district. It's okay to have some non-historic things in the district because that's just inevitable. But if there's too many, like if more than half the properties, say, in the district are non-historic, then you probably don't have a good case for a district. You might want to redraw the boundaries to limit it just to a section where there's many more historic buildings and leave out portions that have a lot of non-historic buildings.
You have a particular percentage when you're evaluating applications that come in. Is there a particular percentage that looks more favorable? Where's the line, I guess, is the question. Like, for example, if it's 60% of the buildings are historical in this area, or 70 or 80%. Like, do you have a particular number formally in mind?
Officially, there's no legal percentage for how many historic versus non-historic you can have. Typically, we try and go by 50-50. Is more than half historic, is less than half historic. But technically, the only requirement is that the district collectively has to convey historic significance. Like, if you take the whole thing as a whole, does it still look like its historic appearance? Does it still convey historic importance to the average person? So, and that can be subjective. You know, one reviewer might say, no, that's not good enough. Another one might say, no, it's fine. It's painfully subjective.
Things like that, where, getting the sense of you're standing in town.
Right.
And then which makes perfect sense. I see where you guys are coming from there. Now, is that going to be, does it have that historic feel now, or we're looking at these buildings, can we get it back to that point? Does that make sense? Like, for example, you look at some of the architecture in these 1920s, 1930s, and 40s buildings on Main Street, and it's incredible. But then several of these buildings have like 1990s sweet vinyl facades plastered on top of them. You know, obviously what we would encourage as proponents of this district would be that, you know, we want to help it make sense for the building owners to bring these back to historical significance.
Mm-hmm.
Do they still count as buildings that would potentially be convey the feel historic? Is there yet?
It depends. For nomination, we have to review the property in its current condition. We can't consider what you want to plan in the future. We have to determine it based on what it looks like at this very moment. Now, in a district especially, if a building has had some alterations, it can still qualify as historic. It just depends on how severe the alterations are. Like, if a building has some new window replacements, it might still be okay. If you have a brick building that's completely covered in vinyl siding, no, that's not going to fly. But and certainly the tax credits can be used to reverse some alterations if the property is already considered historic. And theoretically, if you have a district listed and you have a non-historic building in the district, if someone were to remove the alterations and restore it back to its original appearance, we could then go back and redesignate it as historic. It takes a bit more paperwork, but it is doable technically.
Yeah, for potential investment, I think that's very significant.
So down the road, then you. Oh, you say, okay, this now looks like it's.
So to say,
Both a lot.
yeah, we're
That would be
all about the coverings.
Yeah, it would be.
Lipstick on a pig fix.
So does it have to be the inside too?
For districts, usually not.
Question.
Right, well, if we don't have anything else, we'll look forward to the tax credit discussion.
Mine, Cody's very thorough. So.
Districts, usually not. They cut off the
Question
recording.
of if you were being recorded.
I'm hearing my own voice recording. The recording.
Thanks, Tyler.
Help us.
Yeah. Super informative. Yeah, like that gave us that's the baseline. The questions that you answered, so many of the questions that were at the root of the fears, for lack of better terms, that were at the root of the fears over the district. I had a meeting in April of last year, with several of the property owners on Main Street, and their fear, the district, was that it would restrict their building. Like, that's exactly why they didn't want to go after a district.
Yeah, the only restrictions are whatever the city would choose to apply, create. You know, you're in charge of creating your own ordinances for preserving the district. Or not, you can just let it be at your own risk.
I know. Very good information, and I forget stuff, so it's probably better that.
We do have a PDF guidebook on our website too that explains a lot of what I just said. It's more applicable to individual buildings, but you can use some of it for district.
You knocked it out in like 15 minutes. Are you kidding?
Nobody's something about it.
Yeah, nobody's gonna go after the PDF. They can just watch this and be like, oh, here's the gist.
Yeah,
Then you have to.
Yeah.
I try to be concise. I'm not good with extemporaneous speed.
And then Cody is just, you know, he's hilarious because you're just so dry. We're very passionate about our work. I promise you. Both of us are very passionate. So, all right. Okay. Thank you. Okie dokes. Thanks, Tyler. Okay, so my portion of the talk, and I'm Meredith Drystad, I should say, I'm the tax credit coordinator and the certified local government coordinator. And I'll kind of break down both of those items a little bit more. But this is one of our more recent historic tax credit projects. You may have recognized this. This is in Fayetteville. And so this was a house that was burnt out by fire and then totally rehabbed, and now it's a wedding venue space. It's very nice. So it's kind of small, but I'll kind of talk about some of the general and sort of more ambiguous benefits of listing in the National Register are. And as Cody said, there's really no, holding point. There's no review of these projects unless it's created at the municipal level. So it have to be something that your community would be interested in doing, something like Fayetteville or something like Lewisburg or Wheeling, where they have design review. So it's not a requirement, but if you do have those kinds of items, and if you have historic districts, we're hoping that just the idea of it being a historic district is going to do things like protect investment. So local business owners, local property owners are going to retain and increase property values generally because they know this is historic. They know that keeping up that appearance is very important. These things also promote smart growth. We like to call it smart growth instead of just growth for the sake of growth. It really encourages better, more innovative and sustainable design. So you're not just, like you said, sort of covering up a historic building, but now you're thinking about ways to retain the historic masonry look and keep that look while also making it usable for modern day use. Of course, it enhances the sense of pride and place in local community. Generica is this term that we use in preservation where, you drive into a town, it looks like any other town in the world. It looks like, you got your McDonald's on the corner, all your gas stations, and you don't know where you are. Versus driving to some place like Oak Hill, where you have all these great historic features, you know exactly where you are as soon as you come into town. You've got that downtown that's historic. And then you get to learn from those places. Why were these buildings built? Who was here first? And what is that history? And what is that legacy? It benefits the environment to retain historic buildings. So reuse of historic buildings, we always say the greenest building is one that's already been built because you're not putting all that extra, number one, dumping things into a landfill, and number two, creating new materials you're retaining. Like I said, it's a tool for education. So keeping alive the historic reasons why these structures were built and actually keeping a record of those too for future generations. And then big for you guys, it's positive economic impact for tourism purposes. Nobody wants to go into a community that looks like Generica. People want to go into communities that look like unique and cute and quirky, and they have a historic feeling. So it really promotes bringing in new people who are interested in seeing that historic downtown. And also working with companies, remote workers. That's a big thing for West Virginia right now, trying to get remote workers to come in here and move to these communities to have a higher quality of life. So, and then the big thing, of course, is financial incentives. So we're going to talk about mostly historic tax credits, grants, and potentially some low interest loans that can come to historic building owners. So the couple buildings down in Matewan that have been part of our project, and they kind of have a number of different financial tools. But it's just a really cool work. They had a damage to their parapet wall on the side of the right-hand side of the building there. So there's a reconstruction on the top of the parapet wall to make it sound. So for many financial incentives, properties must be listed in the National Register of Historic Places, and they must maintain integrity. So that's another reason why we want to keep that integrity in our downtown so that people can use these financial tools. And then the building work must meet the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Scary, scary title, but we'll get into that. So the standards are basically, we have 10 standards, but the idea really is that we are retaining historic details. We are repairing rather than replacing. We're trying to avoid creating a false sense of history and trying to retain alterations over time that have historic character. We're trying to keep archaeological resources in place if there are archaeological resources. I will say that's very rarely entered into the equation with a tax credit. Rarely do we use that archaeological idea. And the Secretary of the Interior standards also allow for sympathetic and compatible additions as well.
This is specifically for taking advantage of the grants and tax credits. and
This
things.
is
So it's
correct.
got nothing to do with if the property owner chooses not to take advantage
Right.
of those.
Right, if you don't, right, if you're listed on, well, I'll say this, if you're listed on the National Register and you don't want grants or tax credits, none of this is gonna apply to you. You can do whatever. You could list a building and demolish it the next day. We wouldn't have any say in it. But if you are getting these financial incentives, that's where these come into play. Yeah, very good point. And this is Interwoven Mills on the left here. This is a 9-building complex in Martinsburg that was a textile mill in the turn of the century. And so they've turned these 9 buildings into apartments and I think like a brewery and a restaurant. So that's been a huge project of ours. So you can see in the background some of those brick buildings. This is just one of the apartments. That's a great view. Next one. So I'll touch on a couple of our office's grants as well before we start diving into the bigger projects. But survey and planning grants are kind of the first step, and this might be applicable for you all if you're looking to have us pitch in to help with getting a consultant to nominate your district and survey your district. So places like in the top right there is Eleanor, the town of Eleanor in Putnam County. Okay. And they used one of our survey and planning grants to survey the district. It was one of Eleanor Roosevelt's New Deal community districts. So they surveyed the district to see if it still had enough integrity to be a district, and then they eventually nominated that district with this grant. So it's a 60-40 matching grant. So we provide 60% of the funding, and you all provide the 40. Or if you partner with a certified local government, which is Fayette County is a certified local government, then you can receive a better match, and we pay 70%. It can also fund things like workshops and lectures. So in the bottom right there is a picture of Mr. Bob Yap, who is based out of Missouri. He's a famous mason and carpenter and everything under the sun. PWV and Weston brought him in to rehabilitate this downtown building and do a masonry workshop at the same time. So this grant is used for that, which is a really, really cool endeavor. And then also anyone within a historic district can also take advantage of preservation planning and pre-development planning. So if you're looking for tools like assessment of your historic building and looking to draw up plans for the building, this can help fund those plans. This can help fund any kind of pre-development work along those lines. So I'm thinking of surveys of, window surveys and things like that. So it helps fund all of those things. Also archaeological surveys and things like just creating awareness booklets and things like that for districts. So it's a really wide ranging grant. It can be used to fund a number of things. And the QE Benz building is a great example of using that for pre-development up and dealing. Our state development grants are the physical preservation grants that our office offers on a yearly basis as well. It is a 50-50 matching grant. And this is another one in Fayette County, if you probably know. So this is Tyree Tavern. Yeah, this is Tyree Tavern, which is in Ansted, and it received a development grant. It's one of the oldest structures in Fayette County, and really, really cool tavern. It has a lot of different history from, early settlement to the Civil War and all kinds of things. So it's a really cool one. But basically we provide up to $50,000 per project, and it's of course a competitive grant, but you can receive up to $50,000 from us to do some kind of major rehabilitation work. So they used it for a roof, which has yet to be put on, but we're hoping soon. So in order to receive this grant, you must show that it somehow benefits your community. We have a lot of applications, so I wish we could give all of our money to everybody who applies, but you do have to create a very competitive application to receive this grant funding. But not to say that people who are private homeowners can't receive this grant. In fact, usually they do receive this grant. We almost every year have a couple of private homeowners who can receive funding. So you kind of get local stakeholders to write letters of support and show that this is an important resource for your community for that. Next. Our office also offers emergency grants. This is in Fairmont, one of the historic buildings downtown. Had a parapet wall completely fall off and hit some cars below. Thank goodness nobody was hurt. But with high winds and things like that, sometimes you need these quick turnaround grants. So this is a rolling deadline and is available when we have extra funding, but we often do, which is great. So usually it's for circumstances out of the owner's control, and it's not for things like deferred maintenance. So if over time, you know your roof has been leaking and we can tell that it's been leaking for a long time, we usually can't fund it with the emergency grant. But if it's something like a major storm event or something that was just unforeseen, that's what this grant is for. And that is also a 50-50 matching grant, and it's up to $10,000. I'll talk a little bit about grants outside of our office, since we work with so very many. So the National Park Service's biggest grant for physical rehabilitation is the Save America's Treasures Grant. It is as Congress apportions funding. Usually December is when we see the application come out for this. Properties must have national historic significance or be national historic landmarks, which is the highest designation they can have. So it does require kind of a really historic resource, but projects can receive between $125,000 and $750,000 in grants. Fall Run, this is really great for communities. So communities receive these grants. Wheeling, I'm trying to think who else has received it in the past. Mostly Wheeling, to be honest with you. But they have received these a number of times, as well as our preservation nonprofit and our own office has received these. So it's a pass-through grant wherein some entity, whether it be a municipality, a nonprofit, our office like a SHPO, can apply for grant funding, and it's a large package of grant funding, and then other people in that community can apply for funding directly. So Wheeling does things like facade improvement grants through this kind of grant funding, or they might do a total rehab. So these buildings in Wheeling, we're privy to that funding.
Where, when you use that grant, where's the funding typically housed and dispersed from?
It's from the federal government, so it's from the Park Service, and then it comes passed through say like your city, or a certified local government office would be the one who is essentially creating another grant application for property owners to apply for that funding. So it's a pass through. It takes a couple steps, but it's a good chunk of change.
Is this after the historical preservation, after it's a historical?
Yes, this would only be for buildings that are listed, so. And contributing. Okay, so we're getting into the tax credits. So the residential tax credit, and I use the same photo, even though we have so many residential tax credits, but there's no deadline for any of the tax credit programs, but I'll sort of talk about our smaller tax credit first. The residential credit is for homeowners who are rehabbing their own home. So if you own a property, but you don't live in it, you might rent it out. That's not covered under the residential credit. That would be the commercial credit. So this is a 20% state income tax credit on your qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs. So major things like roofs, repoint masonry, window repair, in-kind sympathetic replacement of windows, porch repair, foundations, also HVAC, plumbing, electrical, interior work for floors. That's all part of the QREs.
This is federal tax, right?
No, this is a state.
Yeah, there are both.
Yes.
But what we're talking about specifically now is on the state side.
This is a state. So the residential tax credit is only through our state office. So it's just me reviewing them. And if you yourself don't owe that much in tax credits, you can sell or transfer those tax credits. That's how people make it kind of liquid more quickly. You must meet the material rehabilitation test, which is essentially spending 20% of the building itself's assessed value during this rehabilitation, which is usually pretty easy to meet, to be honest. If you're just replacing a roof, usually you meet that rehab test. But anyway, you reach out to your county's assessor's office and you say, how much is just the building value worth? And you just have to spend 20% of that in your rehab. And then of course, work must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. And that is for interior and exterior work as well.
So you have to go back to the original electrical.
No, update. It's a rehabilitation, thank goodness. So we're looking to make it usable for modern day use, thank goodness. And we don't care about things like if you have a historic toilet, we're not going to make you keep a historic toilet. unless you really want to. So, you know, things like that. But we look inside and outside for these projects. And then the big kahuna, the big one, the commercial historic tax credit is a huge program in the state, and in last year alone, we leveraged over $70 million in private investment through this program, which earned historic building owners over $17 million in state historic tax credits. So it's a massive program, and it's almost double that this year. So it's just growing. It is for income producing buildings. So if you do own a, you know, like what was once a historic private residence and now you rent it out, that could be a commercial historic tax credit project. It's anything that's earning you income. It is, which doesn't mean that necessarily you do earn income. So if you do the historic tax credit process and nobody comes to your business, we're not going to take the money back. It just is, that's the intention of it, is it's income producing. So it's a 25% state income tax credit, which is transferable or sellable, and it's a 20% federal income tax credit, which is not transferable. So whatever entity applies has to use that 20%. So grand total, that's 45% back on your qualified expenses through these tax credits. You must expend the adjusted basis of the building. So this is really meant for buildings that need a lot of work. So the adjusted basis would be, there's a formula online, it's complicated, but say you were to purchase a building in town for $50,000, you would have to spend $50,000 to receive this credit. So again, it's really meant for buildings that need a ton of work.
Difficult.
Right. And in a lot of places, it's not exactly, it's not difficult. Again, we're meeting the Secretary of the Interior standards inside and out. And it, again, must be used as an income producing property after the project is done for 5 years by the same entity. So the idea there is that someone isn't flipping a building and selling it right away. We want to keep people there. And on the right here is the Progress Building in Huntington. It's one of our recent projects. And you can see on the top there, it had this really ugly modern stone facade that was not in keeping with the historic character. And like I said, it was modern, so we could remove it, and we opted to return it to its historic appearance on the first floor. So it's much more welcoming, and it keeps that look of the historic building.
So when it comes to like the qualified renovation expenses in the historical district on a building, I think this one is a perfect example. So like when you guys would have showed up in town and you saw this building, it had that facade on it. The intention, I guess, was with the facade, it was not historic, right?
No, it was actually historic because most of the building is still, you can still see the historic.
So then if we're playing the what if game and let's say that facade went up like the next level of windows, so like 2/3 of it was covered in that.
Mhm.
Would that have been a building that did not qualify?
It would be tricky. We'd be asking questions like, are the window openings the same size as they were historically? What kind of materials are covering? That would be a tricky one. Usually facades, kind of the end of the first level. It can be trickier when it's a smaller building. Usually they don't go all the way up because it was just not economic to do that. But so it's kind of case by case. I hate to give you a
Oh, that's great. That's
kind of a loosey-goosey answer.
the right information is the information we need. So
Yeah.
we really appreciate
Yeah.
that. So like if the building owner's intention was to take that facade off.
Yes.
Well,
Yep.
and then that's, you know, what that building owner is going to be questioning is like, is it worth the risk? Is there a chance that I'm not going to be reimbursed for
Right.
the expenses of doing this, or some other surprise could come
Right.
up?
It's a great question. Now, what we do when we see ones like this, if this was not contributing to the district initially, say this was entirely covered, but we knew that there was a historic appearance below that covering, what we would do is we would ask the building owner to remove a portion of the facade to see if that historic material was still below. And then we could say, yes, we can see that this is still there. We can approve it for its part one, saying that we would consider this contributing if this facade was removed, sort of a guarantee. And then you can move forward with your tax credit project and removing.
Okay, so then that removes enough of the risk to make it feasible for that private
Exactly.
business owner.
Right.
As long as they can prove that they can,
But there is still
they can
something.
keep that, part under it.
Yes, exactly. So sometimes, you know, it might be something where, and Cathedral Cafe is kind of an example of this in Fayetteville. They reached out about maybe doing a tax credit, and they have a facade that is like I can't come up with the name of it, but it's that faux stone facade that was put on in like the 50s. So now we would consider that to be historic, but the district period of significance was earlier than that. So I think it was like 1930s or 40s. So the challenge therein was, we don't want to have them remove this facade because now, if this nomination were to be updated, it would be considered contributing. So that would be a situation where you want to just update the district or kind of call into question the period of significance. It gets complicated.
Well, it's interesting about the importance of the district following a consistent theme. So the components need to match. That matters.
So they're all working in tandem to create, a sense of a historic district, but then within that, each building needs to contribute in and of itself. Those are very good questions, yeah. For sure. Next, and we do big historic tax credit workshops too, where I come into town and I go through step by step what the applications look like, how this process works, because it does get very complicated. But at any rate, those are the general financial incentives for historic districts. Questions?
So what we have this week. And so Sal's has offered set credits. Is that like the same thing? Like they said, if you donate this tax credit.
It could be. There are a lot of tax credits. Tourism has a tax credit as well. And then things like, there's like the low income housing tax credit for buildings that seek to do that. So it could be, or it could be a different credit. Yeah. People will often, to make projects like this happen, there are developers who know how to leverage all these different credits to basically pay for rehabilitation. So that's, those are the companies that come into town and say, okay, here's how you're gonna wanna do this. Here are the steps you'll take in terms of like creating an LLC, in terms of who's gonna, use the federal credits and who's gonna sell state credits and what banks might buy those state credits. So there are people out there to help with these things, but it's, Cody and I started within 2 weeks of each other, and we've been here for almost 4 years. And I think we have a grasp of it now. It's complicated.
Complicated, but doable.
But doable, absolutely. We have a lot in Fayetteville, honestly. The elementary school is one, all the different school buildings in town, those are all tax credits. Some of the smaller buildings in town, some of the residential, the commercial buildings in town, and obviously the SF station was a historic tax credit. And that was a case wherein the SF station was not contributing to the district.
The SO station, is that the place that just gas
It was
station?
a gas station. It was that metal gas
It was
station.
a gas station when I was a kid.
Yeah, yeah. So they totally rehabbed all the pedals.
Truth only hurts if it should.
No, but it's a great one now. So, things like that, those are all tax credits, and it's cool. It's great because I love to work with these folks. And we also, we want to be approachable. We want to make these credits work for everybody. So we don't want to say no, you can't do that. So we work with everybody. If somebody says, I have this idea for this, I'm saying, well, you can't really do it that way, but let's try it maybe this way. So we keep the character a little bit better. That's what we're hoping to do.
For us in Oak Hill, so this is the what if game, right? So our purpose today, and I cannot thank you guys enough for taking the time to come down here and explain something this complex on a level you understand it and in a logical order, so it all makes sense. So you guys are awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Happy to do it.
For Oak Hill. So we talk with the building owners if they feel like this is, or we feel like there's enough support to move forward.
Yeah.
What's the next step that we would need to take in figuring out where the lines would be potentially for our district? Like, how do we go about getting that party started?
You want to hit that one?
I'd say your first step, once you see you have enough public support, would be to find a historic preservation consultant to survey the area for you. And you can either pay the whole thing out of pocket, or you could wait to apply for our survey and planning grant, which the applications are due October 31st of every year. And it does take a while for the grant to kick in. I think this year's are just now starting. The ones applied in October 2024, just now starting right now. So if you If you're willing to wait a while, you can do that route and do the grant, or you could just pay for the whole thing out of pocket.
And you could partner with,
Did you get a grant? and Pay yourself back?
Yeah, can you get reimbursed?
you
Like,
get reimbursed, yeah.
you could start the,
Well, no, I would say that, no, you cannot do the work before you're awarded the grant, so, and then we have to go through state purchasing procedure, so it slows things down a little bit, but.
Yeah, there is a bidding process too if you get the grant. So if you want complete flexibility and who you want to choose to do the project, you might want to have to pay out of pocket. If you do our grant, you have to go with the lowest bidder.
The lowest responsible bidder, yes.
Lowest responsible.
oh, I was going
We
to
have
say.
some consultants who are not
Just for
responsible.
$5.
We wanna make sure that your project is good and it's worth it to you, so. Cause it is a good chunk of change to do these things, since it's so intensive. But the nice thing, like Cody said, once you get someone to survey it, it's not out of the realm that you take that information and you do the nomination yourself, like. The survey kind of is like the majority of the work done. So, you know, if someone was.
Do it too, they might do a package deal, just whatever looks financially sensible.
Right, I think Eleanor did a package deal, they did survey and the same company backed on with that grant, did the nomination too.
They did the whole thing for 40,000 maybe.
Yeah, the whole thing.
But they did the entire town, so we're talking hundreds of little houses and buildings.
It's huge.
I think, my thought would, of course, obviously, well, this is my thought, right? I don't necessarily even have a dog in the fight at the moment. But my thought would be the commercial has the greatest potential economic impact to the area, right? We could help the building owners more. And then your thought be, we just like shut up and listen to the community to see if people with homes in the area are interested in being considered as well. Just get some feedback from them.
And the big fear with that is always, I don't want someone trying to do a house. But that's not what this is, as long as the city decides not to do that, so, because our office doesn't review that, the federal government doesn't, so but it is a big misinformation campaign that we're always fighting against, being like, I know you've heard of like Gettysburg, I know you've heard of all these places where they're like, you can't paint the house a different color, and that is not what we do.
It's legit, yeah.
But yeah, and we're always happy to, if, you know, you wanna come back and have a meeting with more folks, we're happy to come back and say, walk through it again and be like, you know, here's what the deal is, so. We're available.
Check to make sure, a few folks were texting me, we got stuff, yeah, you all actually answered all of their questions already.
Wow.
That's awesome.
So if we had, this is into town to the bridge, that's what.
Roughly.
We would just, we'd have to have the majority of half of the owners.
Yeah,
What about the ones that weren't willing to?
Well, they would be dragged into it too, but.
And anyway,
And they win anyway, and at the end of the day, you know, it's hopefully people can understand that this is just really honorary, but there are benefits, financially.
The way it works for owner consent is, we don't go around giving them a paper saying you want it listed, yes or no. They don't have to give a form saying we consent to this, but we do have to announce to the community that the project is going to happen. And if they do object, they have to send us, our office, a written objection, preferably notarized, saying, I object to the listing, blah, blah, blah. And if more than half of the property owners send us a written objection, a certified written objection, then the project doesn't move forward. They can't take this.
oh yeah, and if there's that kind of blowback against it, we would never let it get as far as.
Right, and you wouldn't want to
waste your time with that, if the, shut up and listen to the people, right, if.
Yeah, they're,
that far against it, but I think this comes a long, this puts us a long way in getting the correct information, the foundational information out.
Yeah.
To get this potentially started. Like the house right across the street, for example.
oh, that cute little one.
One district. A lot of towns have multiple districts. Some towns have like one district for the downtown commercial area. They might have a second district for the residential neighborhoods. if they have distinct separate histories.
And I'm thinking of like the school over there, which is kind of in between commercial and residential. You know, someday someone might want to individually list that too, which would also incentivize, you know, would also provide tax credits and grants if it was. So, you know, there are ways around having to do a whole nomination, whole district for everybody at once. But Cody and I are gonna wander around town, with things, so, and then we might have a good idea too. But you guys have a really great downtown core here. Those buildings are really.
Yeah, don't have anybody in them, that's. Who wants to lay in them?
No tax, yeah.
Yeah.
Having the amphitheater here also is awesome. I think one of the challenges that we've kind of recently run up against, which makes sense, is, you know, trying to close down like a section of Main Street for events and those kind of things. The hospital's right here. So cutting off a way to the hospital is not
Big time. That's a big draw.
having correct information, accurate information out there, just getting everybody on the same page is, I think, super important.
Well, we'll leave some business cards and stuff with you too, and I think you know how to get in touch with us, but happy to answer any other questions come up.
Thank you guys so much for your time.
Happy to.